Precious are our lives, sacred we be. We are one people, we're one family, and so we resolve, whereas it be. Sing with me, sing together. And so we resolve, whereas it be, peace. Peace shall prevail in our communities. Fill up the room. Peace, 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 peace. Peace shall prevail in our communities. Though I am not Muslim, it could have been me. Had I been the Jew I am in Hitler's Germany. And so we resolve, whereas it be, courage. Courage shall prevail in our communities. Courage, 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 courage. Courage shall prevail in our peace, and peace shall prevail in our communities. Friends, friends shall prevail in our communities. Love, love shall prevail in our communities. And so it shall. Thank you, everybody.
Denis Moynihan has worked with Democracy Now! Since the year 2000. He's a best-selling author and a syndicated columnist with King Features. He lives in Colorado, where he founded community radio station KFFR 88.3 FM in the town of Winter Park. So we welcome Denis.
Very much. Thank you for that wonderful song and welcome. And it's great to be here with you all on this report back from the two major party political conventions, not the only parties, but the two major parties that dominate our political life here. So it's been quite a exhilarating, grueling work period the last 2 weeks. And Amy will go into some depth about what we saw, reported on. I have, as Amy said, been working with Democracy Now! For some time. This isn't our first time here at Town Hall in Provincetown, and maybe some of you have been to some of the other events. I'd have to say, fairly raucous events with the late great Howard Zinn and your neighbor Noam Chomsky, and of course Norman Mailer was here one night. It was during probably the first term of the Bush years, so it was a long time ago, and we've come a long way, but it was quite a great event. I want to thank John Braden for doing such a great job as such a dedicated steward of WOMR and WFMR, and Amy Davies for making Provincetown TV. We were just over at the station doing some preparations, and I guess you all were, like us, listening to Lady Di's program, great music program. So in that, Lady Di had asked as we were leaving for 3 more sustaining members to the station, because there's a pledge drive now, and it's kind of, a lot of what we write about in this book is the climate crisis and the response to it, or the non-response to it. And this kind of pursuit of sustainability, and part of what we do, Amy and I and the folks at Democracy Now! Is try to support stations like Provincetown TV and WOMR to create a sustainable model for independent media. And at the core of any sustainable media institution are all of you, the listener, viewer, donors, supporters. And so when you hear someone like Lady Di or anyone else ask you on the airwaves for to become a sustaining member, that is, it's a really important call to action to consider, to think about how you can chip in what you can every month in a way that allows the station to become sustainable, to plan, and to build up a small reserve, hopefully, for when the rulers on Wall Street collapse the economy. And it's really, well, as we heard, if you heard Joe Stiglitz on Democracy Now! This week, he said there's, nothing fundamental has been changed to prevent a financial calamity like has happened in 2008. So, at any rate, it's wonderful to be here. My folks were born and raised in Massachusetts, came to Cape Cod as kids during the Depression years, and then as they grew up and had our family, took us here. At the time, through the work, the peripatetic work of my father, we were in upstate New York, and what qualifies, I would say, nobly as a hick town, but a small town in upstate New York. And we would come down, and before any of us were in college and there was a little money in the family, we would have 3 weeks in the high point of the summer. That was great. As we got older and the demands on the family finances got greater, we reduced it to a week in the preseason, and it was at that time, I was about 12 or 13, that we got a place on Commercial Street. So it was just a quick, we used to be down in Wellfleet, South Wellfleet, just spend 3 weeks on the beach, but up here in P-Town, it was a bit of a different experience for a 12-year-old. It was 1977, and you can imagine to come from a town where actually we had, I think, 1 or 2 gay people in Plattsburgh, New York in 1977, if you were to judge by the prevailing wisdom and mores of there at that town. But to come down here and to see the vitality, the vibrancy, the energy of the community, on a Saturday night in front of Spiritus as a 12-year-old, it was like, whoa, there's something else going on in the world that we don't have in Plattsburgh, or at least we had it because we did have a huge military base up there. But no, that was, don't ask, don't tell. It wasn't even, but it was less than 10 years after Stonewall. And imagine, and it just reminded me about the work that we try to do at Democracy Now!, and which is the subtitle of the book. It's Democracy Now! 20 Years, Covering the Movements Changing America. And I'm thinking about that early experience, that early exposure to just the kind of frenetic joie de vivre that was evident here, just out in front of us where we are tonight in 1977, 78. But we were on the brink of a massive epidemic. And to imagine how many of those teenagers, men in their 20s, who didn't survive that era. And it's impossible to know, but we all know so many didn't. And what happened as well, it was at 77, 78 when a failed or a 2-bit actor named Ronald Reagan was conspiring with William Casey on how to launch what they call now the October surprise to kind of steal the election from Jimmy Carter, and the Reagan-Bush years and the absolute kind of systematic, programmed ignoring of the AIDS epidemic and the death that followed from that government inaction. But what came from that and grew out of the organizing in the LGBT community was the response, the organizing that happened at many levels, most notably and perhaps publicly, visibly, the ACT UP actions. And so that's part of what we write about. There's a good deal of the book is devoted to the whole trajectory of the LGBT movement and how it's developed and focused more recently on marriage equality. But it's a social movement that is complex and has a rich history and remains newsworthy on a daily basis. And you'll certainly, Amy can even comment on some of how that manifested at these two big conventions that we've been covering for the last 2 weeks. And so the work as a news organization to focus on the daily news, to give the drumbeat coverage, but also to delve deeper to understand what the social movements are, the activism, the organizing, and it prompts us, it inspires us to look at stories from different angles, to interview different people, to acquire different sources. And I hope that the result is that Democracy Now! Proves to be a daily avenue for information that informs and inspires you the way it has me. I came to Democracy Now! As an organizer myself. Essentially first protesting on the streets throughout the 90s and getting ignored by the media, and then realizing, well, there are a few media outlets that actually will report on some of these actions. Part of the organizing I was doing at the time led up to the major protest against the World Trade Organization in Seattle. And by that point, I was like, we really need a media strategy so that these protests don't just get derogated by the mainstream press or ignored. And so in the organizing for that large protest in late 1999 in Seattle, there were several thousand people that were working to challenge this global trade treaty, really the predecessor, the follow-on to NAFTA, which was passed and implemented in '94, and now we have the TPP. And Amy, we saw all week in Philadelphia, just a consistent opposition to this hated and secretive trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But in '99, it was the WTO. There was a massive protest. We were planning it, and at the time felt that it was not worth our time. Many felt it wasn't worth our time to engage with the corporate press because they would just belittle the protesters as a bunch of hippies or what have you. But about 5 or 6 of us said, no, let's just take it seriously and do our job. And so we organized press conferences, press releases, and actually did get some of the word out. Most of the press was focused on the tear gas, the rubber bullets, the broken windows. But there was 50,000 people from around the world gathered in the streets of Seattle to say no to this global trade deal, the WTO. And we did get some of the story out, but perhaps most notably was the coverage that we received from Democracy Now! And I just will end by saying, we had organized a small media center. The Independent Media Center had launched a website called indiemedia.org that was an open publishing platform. It was extremely innovative for its time as the Web 1.0. We had video, photos, audio, print stories. Was getting actually more hits than CNN.com on the week of the protest itself. And it was there that I first met Amy Goodman in person, and Jeremy Scahill, Juan Gonzalez, wonderful journalists that came to see what was happening at the Indie Media Center. And on the first or second night of the protest, it was what could only be described as a police riot. It was dark. The sodium vapor lamps of the city were illuminating the streets, and clouds of tear gas were everywhere. These kind of RoboCops in huge black attire with because it was Seattle, they had huge black ponchos, billy clubs, just really paramilitarization of the streets, and running battles with protesters with flags and banners, running back, being chased back and forth, and it was kind of absolute mayhem. The police had at one point raided our Indie Media Center. We actually had just one door, so there were about 6 of us holding the door shut, and these giant police with their helmets and masks trying to force the door open, and they wedged something through that I'd never seen before. Some of us have seen pepper spray, you know, like a little can of bug spray, but this was a pepper spray hose. And they actually hosed down all of us with this, like a high pressure jet of caustic chemicals. And then we managed to slam the door shut, and they went off to torment some other citizens. But it was quite a scene. And in the midst of all that, we were dedicated to doing the work that we had come to do, but also quite intimidated. Out in the midst of all that, there was this lone figure in the cloud of tear gas with a hand upraised, and something like, a 1999 version of this little audio recorder, which was a little bit bigger back then, and that was Amy Goodman out there recording from the front lines. And since then, through protest after protest, I met them and got to know them better, and ended up actually working, trying to help develop the organization into as sustainable a nonprofit media production company as we could. And so it's been a real privilege for me. We write together. We write a weekly column, as Amy said, that's syndicated by King Features, and occasionally, and with the incredible help of her talented brother David Goodman, will put out a book, which the result of the most recent effort is on the back table there. And thanks to Deb and Nan from Provincetown Books, who are here to make copies available. Amy and I will be signing after.
Please welcome to the stage Amy Goodman.
It's wonderful being here celebrating WOMR. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, John, for working together with Amy at Provincetown TV. I love the Outermost Radio, Furthermost Radio, WFMR, WOMR, and I love coming out here, especially after this last 2 weeks. I also want to give Dennis a special shout out, because how many of you got to see our 2 hours daily coverage from the Republican convention and then the Democratic convention for 2 weeks? Well, I highly encourage you to go to our website. I mean, we've gotten, millions of people are accessing this, because I believe we are the only daily global grassroots TV radio program that spent 2 hours every day intensively bringing you the voices of people outside, on the streets, and on the convention floor, totally devoted to providing a forum for people to speak for themselves. And this would not have happened without our special projects coordinator, magician, extraordinaire, Denis Moynihan, who you have to understand. Oh, and thank you so much to Ruth, who sang that marvelous, marvelous song at the beginning, setting the stage. It made me think of a poster that was up all over in Philadelphia. Love trumps hate. Everywhere was that sign. But to understand the challenges of community media, when we were going to Cleveland, how would we cover this? Where would we do it? Now, if you watch the networks, if you watch the corporate networks, as I do, to see, we can't just bring you what's happening, because the dominant narrative, unless it's deconstructed, no one will believe what it is we're saying. People often call and say, where are you? Are you in an entirely different universe than the rest of the media? But we're right there. When Roger Ailes was forced out of Fox News because of all these allegations of sexual harassment of girls and women. I mean, talking about minors and women who work at Fox News. When he was forced out this past week, we were there at the Republican convention, and I could just turn around. There was Shepard Smith of Fox, and then I turn the other direction, and there's Jake Tapper of CNN, and there is Willie Geist of MSNBC, and Chris Matthews. That's how it works. But to be on the convention floor takes special security credentials. And though we have those, most people don't have those, like most of you. Was anyone at either of the conventions, by the way? Okay, which one were you at? So you know what those security credentials, you can't get anywhere without a security credential. And a lot of the thousands of people who are protesting in the streets don't have them. So if we're broadcasting from the convention floor or for one of the skyboxes, we won't be able to bring you these people. They won't be able to weigh in. And we understood that both at the Republican and Democratic conventions. So we have to set up somewhere outside. We just said fond farewell this morning to PhillyCam, which is Philadelphia's Provincetown Community Television. It is where people make their own media. It's right next to Independence Hall. It is right near where Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and it is a beautiful place where you have people having access to framing their own stories. That's where we broadcast from. Now, most of these places, and we do this at universities all over the country, most of these places could not possibly do a global broadcast. We started on Community and Pacifica Radio 20 years ago, on 9 stations. The next year we went down to 8 stations because we dared to air the voice of Mumia Abu-Jamal on death row in Pennsylvania at the time, and the Temple University Network dropped us specifically, they said, because it was inappropriate to air his voice. Even though we invited on the Fraternal Order of Police, and he wasn't talking about his own case, but talking about, issues like prisoners and father hunger. He was a father and grandfather to so many of the prisoners when he couldn't be one for his own family. Or he'd talk about capital punishment being punishment for those without capital, things like that. And we aired these commentaries, and they dropped us. So we went from 9 to 8. But then we just started to grow. And the week of September 11, 2001, of the horrible terror attacks in New York and Washington, we started on our first Provincetown Community Television in Manhattan. That's MNN, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, just by chance. And we began as emergency broadcasting, and then it just took off. Stations all over the country asked TV stations, can we run you? We were sending out video cassettes, had to be by FedEx, because I felt it was breaking news every day, and we couldn't just send it in the regular mail, but they were video cassettes. The FedEx guys would come, and they'd have huge garbage bags. We would give them filled with these video cassettes so community stations around the country could air Democracy Now! More and more stations asking, and then community radio stations would say, can we air that show? And then NPR stations increasingly would say, can we air that show? And then PBS stations were saying, can we air that show? And we went, for example, in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, we air on the First Pacifica station, KPFA. We air on the NPR station, KRCB. We air on KQED, which is PBS in San Francisco, as well as KRCB Public Television, and on satellite television, both networks. Same in Los Angeles, both public television stations as well as community radio. So we went from 9 community radio stations in 1996 down to 8 the next year. We are now broadcasting on 1,400 public television and radio stations around the country and around the world. And it's just a testament to the hunger for community media. Oh, and to Denis Moynihan, who helps build this network. He was just voted Media Citizen of the Year by the National Federation of Community Broadcasters. He's setting up a full-power FM station in Winter Park, Colorado, and helps build others in Denver and all over this country. It's astounding and critical that we really piece together this patchwork of community media. It presents and provides a forum for the mighty voices of people like you and not like you all over. We need to have media that is not mediated. We need to have media that doesn't mediate voices through a corporate lens or a corporate microphone. I mean, it's critical to the functioning of a democratic society, to our national security. For people in the rest of the world to see us through something other than a corporate lens, and for us to see the rest of the world in that same way. So, sorry, I'm sure I'll be coughing a lot through this talk. There's been a lot of talking going on the last few weeks. But in Cleveland, Denis set up in the old post office in Cleveland, the Democracy Now! Studios. We had to get electricity, we had to get fiber, we had to get internet, we had to get furniture. You are not going to believe this. I mean, just think about the basic things you need to do a 2-hour daily broadcast. He went online and found the government selling a batch of furniture and bicycles in Missouri. And that was sent to us. I think it was for all of the furniture, something like $600. We're talking about many desks, many chairs, all the things we needed to do our work, and about 10 bicycles were thrown in for the lot and had them sent to us. Then in Philadelphia, working with PhillyCam, that was already set up. And he researched online a way for student-run university TV stations, as well as places like PhillyCam, that are fantastic to broadcast out, because they can't. They can't do a global broadcast. They have their own ways of, on universities, you have kind of closed circuit. So imagine working with a group of students who want to make their way in media. And they have done their own local shows, and we come into town with this gadget that we put into their system. Broadcast quality, HD, and suddenly these young people or the community in Philadelphia are broadcasting throughout the world. It is an amazingly empowering experience. Democracy Now! Broadcasts throughout the United States. Also, our headlines translated into Spanish, so we broadcast throughout Latin America, in South Africa, in Japan, many times a day, in Sweden, on radio and on television. They tell us on television, on the open channels, if they don't run Democracy Now! In a day, the protests that come in everywhere from Stockholm to Göteborg, or however you pronounce that city, which I haven't even been able to figure out yet. But we have so much in common with people all over, yet we don't realize this because of what the media does, the kinds of voices that it brings us, so narrow of a minority elite, and I'm not talking about people of color. I mean, think about just what you heard today on Democracy Now! And you didn't just hear about him on Democracy Now!, Khizr Khan. How many of you know the man that I'm talking about? Were you in the audience when he spoke? This remarkable dad from suburban Maryland, who lost his son, Captain Humayun Khan, in Iraq in 2004. You remember after George Bush invaded Iraq, Well, he didn't do it alone. He had congressional approval, and that included Hillary Clinton. Actually, I remember her speech in 2002. It was a powerful speech as she talked about weighing, whether the U.S. should go to war with Iraq, and she laid out all the arguments against it. And then inexplicably at the end, she said, which is why I will be voting for it, as students were being taken out of her offices in New York who were protesting her decision, her imminent decision. It was Republicans and Democrats who decided that the U.S. somehow in retaliation it began for the September 11th attacks, where 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia and none from Iraq. The U.S. would attack Iraq and destabilize this country in the Middle East and bomb the cradle of civilization back to the cradle, leading it into an endless war that continues to this day, the suffering of the Iraqi people. And I remember back then, right after how many U.S. soldiers, not to mention how many thousands of Iraqis had died, that White House Correspondents' Dinner, the radio television correspondents' dinner in Washington, where the press roasts the president and the president does the same. George Bush's gimmick that year was showing photographs of himself in the Oval Office on his knees, checking under the chairs and the tables. Where are those weapons of mass destruction? And you think of the families of the U.S. soldiers who had died. Hardly a yuck moment for them. This is one of those fathers who, together with Humayun Khan's mother standing with her head covered, took the stage in Philadelphia at the Wells Fargo Center. Oh, the Republicans were at the Quicken Loans Arena. They called it the Q, both of them, Quicken Loans and Wells Fargo. Where did they make much of their fortune off the subprime mortgages and loans that devastated this country? And Khizr Khan got up. The most powerful address, as everyone got quiet in the Wells Fargo Center, and said, Donald Trump, you're asking Americans to trust you with their future. He emigrated from the United Arab Emirates when his son was 2 years old. He said, let me ask you, have you even read the United States Constitution? And then reaching into his pocket, he said, I will gladly lend you my copy. Mr. Khan lives in Charlottesville, Virginia, and said, go look at the graves of brave patriots who died defending the United States of America. You will see all faiths, genders, and ethnicities. You have sacrificed nothing and no one. He said, if you want to see the best of America, well, Hillary Clinton had said in telling his story a few months ago, if you want to see the best of America, you need look no further than Army Captain Humayun Khan, who had risked everything in Iraq, telling his fellow soldiers to get away from a suspicious vehicle that looked like it might be a car bomb, and then he himself went forward, and as he approached, it exploded. Mr. Khan said, last night, Hillary Clinton was right when she called my son the best of Americans. He said, Mr. Trump consistently smears the character of Muslims. Conservative pundits all over the country hailed this speech as one of the greatest. We need a media that continues to broadcast these voices, to break down the stereotypes and the caricatures that fuel hate groups, So let me talk a little about where Democracy Now! Originally came from 20 years ago, from Pacifica Radio, which was founded, it was right after World War II in 1949 in the Bay Area in Berkeley, California, by a war resistor named Lou Hill, who came out of the detention camps and said there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. As George Gerbner, the late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania would say, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today. And so Pacifica was born. The first station, KPFA, 1949. The next station, KPFK in Los Angeles, 59. My station in New York, WBAI, 1960. 1977, WPFW in Washington, and 1970, KPFT in Houston. That's the fabulous five, the Pacifica Radio Network. KPFT in Houston and the Petro Metro is the only radio station in the country that was blown up. Went on the air in the spring of 1970, and a few weeks later, the Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens, right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant, which I thought was a good song. They get back on their feet a few weeks later. They rebuild the transmitter. They go on the air. And the Klan straps 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blows it up again. Now it takes KPFT a little time to recover. And the following January of 1971, with PBS in its infancy, they head to Houston to show this important moment. It's going national now. Other networks come. Arlo Guthrie comes back into Houston, and KPFT goes on the air, the phoenix that rises from the ashes. And Arlo Guthrie finishes singing Alice's Restaurant on the air. Now, I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it is a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandma, whether it's an uncle in Iraq or an aunt in Afghanistan, you begin to understand where they're coming from. It breaks down the caricatures that fuel hate groups like the Klan. That's why they're so threatened. You understand where they're coming from. I didn't say you agree with it, with what you're hearing. Right? You may it sounds like my baby, it sounds like my bubba or my aunt or my uncle who you have disagreed with all your life. But it makes it much less likely that you'll want to destroy them. It's that understanding that is the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back. Now, think of all that's happened in the last few weeks. I mean, in the week leading up to the Republican convention, and then now. You have the killing of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge. That's captured on cell phone. Captured on the cell phone of the owner of the store where he sells CDs outside. They're good friends. Captured by a couple who was a little ways away. When the police moved in on him, he's utterly confused. Why are you going after me? Why are you doing this? As they take him down, and we only know this because there's video. They take him down, he's on the ground, he is laying on his back, they take out their gun and shoot him dead. You all have seen this. And then you have the killing, the police killing in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, right next to St. Paul, of Philando Castile. Why do we know this? A most astounding fiance partner actually live streams on Facebook, a kind of new technology, the aftermath of the killing of her boyfriend. It is utterly unspeakable what you're watching as she so calmly narrates, and you see every part of this story. Her hands are on the dashboard because the police officer has told her to put them there, but she has her cell phone and she's speaking into this and she's saying to the officer, why are you doing this? Why did you shoot him? As he lay dying next to her in the car, her 4-year-old daughter in the back seat, and you see the police officer with his gun pointed at them after he has shot him. Why did he shoot him? In Minnesota, he says to her, and you see this live streaming, and this is an important point, because if it had been on her phone, she would have lost her phone. Even the cell phone video footage wouldn't have been enough, but this is now captured for all time online, so the police can't take it. And he's saying he shouldn't have reached in his pocket. You asked him for his license. You asked him, he told you, I have a license to carry. He told you that. He didn't pull out the gun. He told you himself he had a license to carry. But you insisted he show you his license, his driving license. He reaches in, and then you shoot him. And then she is told to get out of her car. She has her child in the car, and there's only police officers. Who is she supposed to leave her child with? But they tell her to walk backwards out of the car, and she's handcuffed. This victim, for what reason is she handcuffed? Could you imagine if some crime was committed in your house and the police come and they force you out as your partner lays dying and handcuffs you? It is unheard of in a different community. We live in different worlds in this country. She is told to walk backwards. They handcuff her. They put her in the car. And they put her daughter next to her. And it breaks your heart when her daughter, who is 4 years old, says, Mommy, I'm there for you. I'll take care of you. I'm here for you, Mommy. You have these 2 police killings, and then the horror in Dallas of a community that protests these killings and is protesting violence, and they hold a march, as people do all over the country, and just as it's coming to an end, 5 police officers are killed by a sniper. The horror. And then something similar happens in Baton Rouge. The horror. This is all unfolding. And then you have, in the midst of the conventions, the police shooting of Charles Kinsey in North Miami. And we see the video, and what we see is a man, a large African-American man with a beard, laying on the ground, on his back, his hands up, and a man sitting next to him, cross-legged, hugging a toy truck. And Mr. Charles Kinsey, who's laying on the ground with his hands up, couldn't have been clearer as he is shouting to police officers who have come, I am a behavioral therapist. My name is Charles Kinsey. He is an autistic young man who has left the home. I've come to help him. He escaped from the home he was in. He is autistic. He's afraid to reach for the man. Charles Kinsey thought, it would be the young man who would be shot by the police as he hugged his toy truck. But he knew if he reached over, he feared they would both be killed. And so he lay on the ground as outstretched and exposed as he could, with at his feet this young autistic man rocking back and forth with his legs cross-legged, hugging this truck, and he's saying, he's autistic, I'm his behavioral therapist, I am unarmed, please do not shoot us. Whereupon the police shoot him in the leg. It is shocking. And when Charles Kinsey, the behavioral therapist, says, why did you just shoot me? The police officer said, I don't know. They take them away. To say the least, the autistic young man is completely traumatized. And the police union then says that it was a terrible mistake that they shot the behavioral therapist. The police meant to shoot the autistic man. We have a terrible problem in this country. And this is why so many people, both at the Republican convention and at the Democratic convention, and of course before this as well, were protesting. More at the Democratic convention. Thousands and thousands of people were marching outside, and in each case they have to demand their right to be able to be heard and not be put off so far from these convention centers that their protest is meaningless, because we have a tradition in this country that we protect free speech. They deeply believe it is dissent that will save us. And we need a media that provides a forum for these discussions and this dissent. I think the media, I think of it as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they're sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. It is dissent that is absolutely critical, that must be preserved, and we see it at every level. You think about this presidential election. I told you the story of Pacifica and how the Klan blew up a radio station because it was allowing people to speak for themselves. But that was a story of like 46 years ago, right? 1970 in Houston, Texas. Who would have thought that we would be talking about the Ku Klux Klan today in 2016? I just bumped into Jake Tapper of CNN, who's saying, I mean, Democracy Now!, he says, you guys have talked more about my questioning of Donald Trump. He said, the response I get to this because of you. I mean, he's on CNN and he says because of us. You know, it is amazing to be able to build this network that is larger than most any program on CNN or MSNBC as we build this network of community media around the world. You know what Jake Tapper of CNN did in questioning Donald Trump. He asked him if he would disavow David Duke's support, the avowed white supremacist, the Klansman. I can't remember if he was the Grand Wizard or the Exalted Cyclops. But Jake Tapper said, will you disavow his support and the support of the Klan? And Donald Trump wavered, he waffled, he paused. And when was the last time you heard Donald Trump hesitate before answering anything? But this one stumped him. He would have to look more deeply into this. What is it that he had to look more deeply into? Which Klan chapter it was? He wouldn't want to generalize to all the KKK chapters in the United States. And now David Duke has said he's going to run for Senate inspired by Donald Trump's run. Now, we need a media that doesn't just talk about the KKK, and especially for young people. And, Democracy Now! Has turned the formulas for audiences on their heads in public media, which is an older audience, predominantly white. Democracy Now! Is a very big, young, diverse audience that's ever growing. I think because we interview people. People sound like, people listen to those that echo something of their own experience. I want to read for a moment the words of my colleague, because I can't talk about Democracy Now! Without talking about Juan Gonzalez, co-host of Democracy Now! For the last 20 years. Juan, we often talk about, his background on Democracy Now! Juan was a leader of the Columbia student strike of 1968. He only recently graduated from Columbia. He's one of the leading journalists in this country. This is not a very well-known story, but he didn't graduate then. Because even though a number of the students were forbidden, at the end, he didn't feel that they should be asking for forgiveness when they led the strike at Columbia. Decades later, I think one of his friends became dean at Columbia, and it was only recently, a few years ago, they said, Juan, you gotta graduate. We want you to be a graduate of Columbia University, and he had to finish a physics class. This is like 40 years later. And they had to find the physics professor that he worked for and that he was a student of, and he was like 90-something, and he was retired. And he said, Juan, if you want to write a paper, I think about social justice and physics, I would accept that. And so Juan did. This is just a few years ago, and he thought it was done, and he was going to graduate that June. I said, can I come to your graduation? He said, come on, I'm not going to be going to the graduation. And he said, it was pretty much a done deal. He's going to get the diploma, except they called him a few days before graduation and said, Mr. Gonzalez? He said, yes. Juan just retired from the New York Daily News after 29 years. I'll tell you about the party for him. Every leading politician, journalist was there. They called him Mr. Gonzalez. He said, yes. They said, you're supposed to get your diploma tomorrow. He said, yes, I know. He said, but you haven't taken your swimming test. And he said, excuse me? He says, you have to swim across the pool. I think, no, this is really true. At Columbia, because they got an endowment from a person whose son maybe died in the Titanic, I think. There's this rule every year that you have to pass a swimming test. And so Juan thought it was a joke. They said, it's no joke. This is sink or swim. You've got to do this. So he heads down, and I don't know what kind of bathing suit he wore, and he head down. He said, there's all these 22-year-old, swim team folks, and he's standing there. And they said, okay, Mr. Gonzalez, jump in. And he said, can I do the side stroke? Can I do backstroke? They said you can do anything you want, you just can't walk across. And so he swam, and Juan Gonzalez is now a proud graduate of Columbia University. So, in December, Juan was the first Latino journalist to be inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame, and the whole Democracy Now! Family went up to Sardi's in Midtown. I'd never been there before, and all the big media was there. CBS had a table, New York Times had a table, everyone, PBS had a table. We had 2 tables, and when Juan was called up, we all stood up and said, Juan Gonzalez presente. I can't remember who is getting the award this year. It was Charlie Rose was there and Leslie Stahl, but it was Juan's speech that put them all to shame. As he stood up, he reflected on his quarter of a century as a columnist. He said, I figured my modest contribution would be not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them. Not simply to entertain, but to change. Not after the fact, but before it, when coverage could still make a difference. I have tried to use as many of my columns as possible to probe the injustices visited upon the powerless. Yes, the rich and famous are also victims on occasion, but they have so many politicians, lobbyists, lawyers, gossip columnists, and even editorial writers ready to jump to their defense that they'll always do fine without my help. I prefer the desperate unknown reader who comes to me because he or she has gone everywhere else and no one will listen. More often than not, I come across unexpected gems, human beings whose tragedies illuminate the landscape and whose courage hopefully inspires the reader to believe that there is indeed some greater good served by a free press than just chronicling or influencing the ouster of one group of politicians by another. We end our introduction of Democracy Now! 20 years covering the movements changing America by saying this book celebrates some of the people and movements who've been making history during our first 20 years. It's not an exhaustive history. It's not intended as a greatest hits of Democracy Now!, but our way of giving back by celebrating some of the ordinary heroes who've done extraordinary things to make the world a better place. I didn't mention that when we went to Cleveland, one of the first things we did was go to a recreational park where Tamir Rice was gunned down 2 years ago, a 12-year-old boy, gunned down by the police. Now, it is an astounding story of what happened, and I came to understand something when we were at the convention that I didn't understand before. You know that Ohio is an open carry state. So it is, people walk around with AR-15s, okay? They're allowed to walk around. Even the police chief didn't think that was a good idea during the Republican convention, but he couldn't get Governor Kasich to apply some kind of ban because Governor Kasich, who wouldn't come, by the way, to the Republican convention, though he was constantly in Cleveland at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and other places with people that week, but he refused to be there with Donald Trump. Kasich said, my hands are tied. We have to pass the legislation, but I can't just do this. I can't stop the open carry around the convention. So, and this is what's remarkable. You don't get this anywhere else. But go to the section of democracynow.org where we cover this action right outside the Q, the Quicken Loans Arena. We got word that there would be some protesters there, so we headed over. We had just passed on the landing by the water. There was a group of people carrying their AR-15s. But we went over here where there was a group of like 12, 13, 14 women clad in pink, you know, the group Code Pink. But they were carrying balls and satchels, tennis balls, 500 of them. They were pink and green, lots of tennis balls. And they went to the front of the queue. And they started to toss them and to bounce them. And on some of the tennis balls, they said, ban guns, not balls. And they were playing with them playfully, and they were throwing them back and forth. And then, well, you know, these are national special security events. They're run by the Secret Service, Homeland Security. And in Cleveland, something like 20 different police departments converged. I've never seen anything like it. You'd see the Indiana National Guard walking this way and the New Orleans police working this way in Cleveland, and then the Cleveland police following up. They were from Sacramento Police Department. They were everywhere. So here's this group of 13 women, 14 women. They're throwing these tennis balls around. The police move in. Give us those balls. And so saying, what are you talking about? They're on the forbidden list. They're on the forbidden list. They are banned. You must hand over these balls. So the commanding officer starts to grab their tennis balls, and he's telling the other officers, take them. And all the police officers are moving in, but they don't know where to put all the balls. And they said to the commanding officer, where do we put them? They said, in your pockets. You just take them away. And the women are saying, led by Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? He said, because they're on the forbidden list. These could be used as weapons. They said you could cut them open, you could put feces in them, you could throw them at police. And Medea said, no, I see what you're saying. But how is it possible that you're banning these balls, but you're not banning the AR-15s? And they said, they're not on the forbidden list. And so you could walk by with an AR-15, but not bouncing a tennis ball. They move in, and then the Indiana National Guard move in, and then another state police move in, followed in as they're in a pincer move, the Cleveland police on horseback. And they are moving in on Code Pink, bouncing their tennis balls. So what I came to understand around Tamir, this 12-year-old boy, you know the studies that show now that police officers think African American children are like 10 years older than they are and see them as a major threat. And so when these officers, I think they were named Garmbeck and Lohman, moved in because they were called, the police department was called, and a 911 call, a man called and said, there's someone in the park who's playing with a gun, but I think it's a fake gun. Somehow the police department says the fake part wasn't transmitted. They moved in, and within 2 seconds, not saying put the gun down, not being threatened, they move in and they open fire on Tamir. But you know, if they see a child as an adult, an African American child, they said he was like 20 years old. Ohio is an open carry state. I mean, even in Cleveland, right there where Tamir was killed, they don't stop these men who are carrying their AR-15s. So even if they thought this was a real gun, I mean, I was asking this of Nina Turner, who is the former state senator of the area, who took us on a tour of the park. It wasn't hard to see where Tamir was killed, where he lay dying, because there are these picnic tables, and there's all these stuffed animals and crosses on the picnic table. And while we were there that day, lots of little children, 2, 3, and 4 years old, were playing around the picnic table. You know, they shot Tamir, he lay dying, and his 14-year-old sister came running, and they tackled her, handcuffed her, and put her in the police car as her brother lay dying outside. No officers were found accountable, and in the midst of the Democratic convention, you know that the remaining officers in the Freddie Gray case in Baltimore had all the charges dropped. No officer has been found accountable in that case. These killings must be documented. We have to change policing in America. We need to have a national conversation that holds people accountable at every level of government. Which brings me to just driving in today to Provincetown. We heard that some officials in Michigan were just indicted for the poisoning of the water supply of Flint. How is it possible? And you know, of course, Democracy Now! Went to Flint, and we did a special on the poisoning of an American city, largely African American city. You know that in the last few years, the governor, and these indictments haven't yet gone to the governor, Rick Snyder, the Republican governor of Michigan. In the last few years, more than half the black population of Michigan has been put under unelected city management. They put in city managers into black cities who then rule those cities by edict. And the mayor and the city council become employees of the city manager. They can be fired by the city manager. And the city manager, whatever city council votes, can overrule. And so what happened in April of 2014, the city manager that had been imposed on Flint decided that Flint, which had gotten its water from the Detroit water supply for over 50 years, clean water, would be switched to the Flint River, which everyone knew is corrosive and dirty. It might save them a couple of $1 million. And so they switched the water supply. People soon got very sick. A number of people died of Legionnaire's disease, which hasn't even been talked about very much. And then the entire population that was drinking this water was drinking in high levels of lead, particularly a crisis for children in developmental stages, poisoning the population. To show how much the city understood what they were doing. And I'm always amazed this isn't talked about more, but I went to the home of a Flint GM worker when we went in the midst of this crisis just a few months ago. The city is switched to the Flint River in April of 2014. In the fall, GM, the engine plant, starts to complain that the water is wrecking the engines that they are making because it is corroding the engines. They appeal to the city manager. They say, we can't do business. We cannot use this water supply. So they get a waiver, and they are taken off. The GM plant is taken off the Flint River supply and switched back to the Detroit water supply. Even the workers were saying, wait a second. That's good. We're going to keep our jobs. The engines will be able to sell them. But what about us? We live in Flint. If it's corroding the engines, what's it doing to us? City manager would have nothing of it. And then in the spring of 2015, almost a year later, the city council votes overwhelmingly to return the city back to the Detroit water supply. So many people were getting sick. A core of people were protesting in the streets. And the city manager, the day after the city council voted something like 7-1 to return them to the Detroit water supply, the city manager said this was an incomprehensible decision and would not have any of this. Finally, the unelected city manager left, but he left a rule in place. No decision would be reversed for a year. The governor started to come under so much pressure. And this is really, by the way, not just a Flint citizen activist-led movement, but a woman-led movement. It has been amazing to see these African-American women of every sector of society coming together, saying this is not a water problem, this is a democracy problem. Demanding that the governor respect this population. And when a leading woman pediatrician decided to crunch the numbers and say, look how many children you have lead poisoned. And then the governor and his people tried to discredit her until they couldn't do it anymore. And until, most importantly, the federal government said they would investigate the governor. He switched it back to the Detroit water supply. But it's too late, because the corrosive Flint River corroded the lead-coated pipes, and now it doesn't matter what water courses through them. And every time the remarkable Karen Weaver, who is a psychologist who ran for mayor on a single platform, I will call a state of emergency in the city, which is what she did when she was elected and she spoke at the Democratic Convention. She says we have to replace the lead pipes. We can't continue to poison our city. I think Michigan has something like $1 billion rainy day fund. They will not use it. I think all of these issues are related. Who is respected in this country and who isn't? Which is why the Black Lives Matter movement is so important. And to see the Black Lives Matter activists in the Democratic convention sitting in their delegations like, oh, the ones in the Colorado delegation who were still holding up signs even on this historic night when the first woman was accepting the nomination of a major party to be the presidential candidate, holding up signs and wearing shirts that said things like, we are not super predators, something that Hillary Clinton had said in, I think it was 1996, her husband, President Bill Clinton, pushing through the so-called anti-crime bill that has led to the mass incarceration of so many in this country. Even they admit this, but what are they doing about this? And Hillary Clinton, because she was very active as a first lady, calling some young African Americans super predators. It is amazing how it's the young Black Lives Matter activists who are not handed a microphone at any party event, not by the networks, of course not by the parties, who've interrupted Bernie Sanders, who've interrupted Hillary Clinton. They have set the agenda to a certain extent in this 2016 election. It is amazing. And it doesn't matter to them who is the politician who's being acclaimed for the Republicans or the Democrats. They want to fundamentally change this country. I'm going to wrap up soon, and Dennis and I are going to sign books, and it's wonderful to be here with all of you. You could get a book, or you could get 2 books, or you don't have to get any book and just come up and say hi. And by the way, please sign up for the Daily Digest. It lets you know our headlines every day, and then you can link in and you can see what it is that you'd like to read, listen to, or watch. It also sends out media alerts. It's from Democracy Now!, and we don't share your name with others. But I want to talk about movements because I think that is the most important shaper, mover, and shaker of history, even in election year. When people ask me what I think about a particular candidate or what I think about President Obama or President Bush before him, I think about movements. They make the difference. You know, it was remarkable when Barack Obama was elected president in 2008. I think the world heaved a sigh of relief because people had felt they had hit their heads against a wall for so long. That wall had become a door. The door opened a crack. But the question was, would it be kicked open or slammed shut? And that's not up to one person in the White House. Right, because when that person sits in the Oval Office, and those who you're used to having the ear of the most powerful person on earth are whispering their demands, if he or she can't point out the window and say, if I do that, they will storm the Bastille. If there's no one out there, they're in big trouble. And that's when that person agrees with you. What about when they don't? It's the movements that make the difference. Now, yes, that election was historic. I mean, it is truly amazing that Barack Obama was the first African-American president in U.S. history in a land with a legacy of slavery. And Michelle Obama talked about this on that first night of the Democratic Convention in a remarkable speech where she talked about what it meant to see her children playing on the lawn of the White House with their dogs, her 2 beautiful African-American daughters, playing on the lawn of the White House, a house built by slaves, she said. This is where I want to bring in Bill O'Reilly. How many of you heard what he said? So Michelle Obama says, I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves, and I watch my daughters, 2 beautiful, intelligent, black young women playing with their dogs on the White House lawn. This was Fox News' Bill O'Reilly's response. Slaves that worked there were well fed and had decent lodgings. The slaves that worked there, he conceded they were slaves. Even Abigail Adams, November 28, 1800, described the enslaved Africans forced to labor on the White House's construction as being half-fed and destitute of clothing, not to mention that they were slaves. This is 2016. This is the major media today. And this is not Roger Ailes, who was forced out. These are the people who remain in place. So it was historic when Barack Obama was elected president. I think afterwards, all of the movements elected him. The anti-war movement, right? What was the main difference between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton? I think it was that he was opposed to the Iraq War and she supported it. She was senator who she voted to authorize the war with a number of Republicans and some other Democrats. It was the anti-war movement who elected Barack Obama. It was the environmental movement. It was the racial justice movement. It was the gay and lesbian movement. It was the immigrants' rights movement. All these movements coming together, they elect him, and it was exhausting. They were exhausted, but also there was this racist backlash led by none other than Donald Trump, the birther movement, right? Demanding to see his birth certificate. Because how could Barack Obama be from this country? The idea of the other, that he continues. The other is the immigrant. The other are the Muslims. The other are the pigs and the Slavs, I think he calls women. These are all the others, right, that are not him. The person who he said he would consult to fix the problems of this country. But the othering of people is why we need media that allows us to know each other. So I think all of these movements did not want to contribute to that racist backlash, though they had growing criticism of what was happening under Barack Obama, right? He said he would close Guantanamo, one of the first executive orders he issued, and it's been 7 years and he hasn't done it. He was opposed to the Iraq War, but has presided over the expansion of wars in the Middle East through drone wars and others. When General Allen was speaking, you may not have heard this if you watch television, but if you watch Democracy Now!, since we were in the audience, the thousands of delegates who were chanting, "No more war, no more war." And then there's the immigrants' rights movement. So many of the leaders of the immigrants' rights establishment now work inside the White House and work outside, and it was they that coined the term. Right around the time Barack Obama's administration passed the 2 million mark, 2 million people deported from this country, more than under any president in U.S. history. It's because movements step back. It's everyone's responsibility. I don't think that's going to happen anymore. Whoever is elected to the White House. These numbers of lack of trust of either of the major party candidates are astounding, the highest in history, these polls show. And the good news is that movements matter. If they flex their muscle, as Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And I just wanted to go very quickly through 1 year where movements really shape this country. But before I do, I wanted to go back to last June. After the horror of Charleston, South Carolina, Democracy Now! Raced down there. And we broadcast from outside the AME Church, Mother Emanuel Church. And everyone now knows what happened. You have a Bible study class midweek. The state senator, the pastor of the church, Clemente Pinckney, races back from the state legislature just to be with his parishioners for midweek Bible study. And they're sitting there, and a young white man who they didn't know walked in, and they welcomed him. Dylan Storm Roof. And within an hour after this Bible study, he blows them away. Not all of them. One woman, he said, he spared her life to be witness, to tell the world what he had done. When he was arraigned, the survivors and family members of those gunned down put this country to shame when they forgave him. This man who wrapped himself in the Confederate flag. I think Dylan Storm Roof unwittingly blew the roof off of the Confederacy. Then this legislature starts to begin to think about taking action by taking the Confederate flag. Would they? They would have to debate this. Taking the Confederate flag down off the grounds of the South Carolina State Legislature. It has flown above the Capitol or on the grounds of the Capitol for over half a century in response to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. That was the white establishment's response to the civil rights movement, and the growing power of African Americans, especially demanding the right to vote, was to fly. It didn't go back to the Confederacy, is what I want to say. It was a response more recently to the civil rights movement. And they then had to decide whether it was time to take this flag down. After we broadcast from outside the church, there was that massive memorial service, funeral at the College of Charleston. President Obama came, sang Amazing Grace. The next day, early in the morning, before the legislature did this, well, it was 5:30 in the morning, to be exact. I think that, ultimately they voted to take it down. And I think if you ask most people in this country who was responsible, they'd probably say, well, the South Carolina governor led the charge, Nikki Haley. But that's not who first took down the flag, the Confederate flag in Columbia, South Carolina. It was 5:30 in the morning on June 27, 2015, 10 days after the massacre at the Emmanuel AME Church. The South Carolina State House glowed in the morning light. It was the morning after this big memorial service. Bree Newsom, a 30-year-old African-American woman from Charlotte, North Carolina, walked toward the main entrance of the building. She was accompanied by Jimmy Tyson, a young white man from North Carolina, and others who scouted the grounds. They observed the scene around the State House, waiting until there were no guards visible. After about 30 minutes, Jimmy and Bree made their move. They walked swiftly toward the Confederate monument, which stands directly in front of the main steps. The tall monument, topped with a heroic image of a Confederate soldier, pays tribute to those who have glorified a fallen cause, slavery. The two activists proceeded to the 30-foot high flagpole that stood directly behind the monument. The Confederate battle flag flapped lazily at the top. Bree Newsom then made her move. She donned her climbing gear, which she learned how to use a few days before. She began ascending the pole swiftly. Tyson watched her from below, ready to break her fall if she slipped. Guards noticed, began shouting at her to come down. Reaching the top of the flagpole, she grabbed the Confederate flag and unhooked it. She said, "You come against me with hatred and oppression and violence. I come against you in the name of God." She declared as she clutched the symbol of the Confederacy, "This flag comes down today." She lowered herself slowly, along with the flag. As soon as she reached the ground, she and Jimmy were arrested. Video of the protests went viral, was seen around the world. Her bail fund quickly raised more than $125,000. Ava DuVernay, director of the Oscar-nominated film Selma, was among the many to hail her, tweeting, "I hope I get the call to direct the motion picture about a black superhero I admire. Her name is Bree Newsom." But within But within about an hour, 2 State House workers raised a new Confederate flag on the Capitol grounds. Later that day, as Confederate flag supporters and anti-racist counter-protesters gathered under the newly raised flag in Columbia, Bree and Jimmy faced a bond hearing at a nearby jail. As part of the compromise that was struck by the South Carolina legislature in 2000 to keep the Confederate flag flying next to the State House, lawmakers escalated the penalty for tampering with the flag when they took it off the Capitol and put it on the grounds. They increased the penalty if anyone scaled the flagpole and took it down. So Bree and Jimmy were charged with defacing state property, facing a penalty of 3 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. After we got into the jail arraignment cell and watched Bree and Jimmy arraigned, we raced back to the lobby where people were gathering so that they could see or greet Bree and Jimmy if they were released. I interviewed one young woman named Tamika Lewis who had come with Bree to be a part of the action. And I asked her how she felt. She said to see that flag actually come down and all the things that it represents being taken down by a strong black woman was one of the greatest symbolic images one person could ever witness. Another young woman named Carol Parker, who didn't know Bree from anything, she grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, but she did know that she walked past that Confederate flag every day, which denigrated her, which shamed her, but she was forced to do. She said she came to the jail to show her support, saying, Bree has done what our governor hasn't had the courage to do, what our General Assembly hasn't had the courage to do. She went up there and did what had to be done when it needed to be done. Shout it from the rooftops. It was Bree Newsom who took down the symbol of the Confederacy in South Carolina. Now, just briefly, the year 2011, to show the power of movements for those who have lost hope. Go back to December, to the Arab Spring. A young man named Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia, who sees there's no opportunity in this dictatorship. And he comes out of university, has to sell fruit and vegetables in the local market, and he's harassed by authorities, and they take his scale. He can't take it anymore. He sets himself on fire, and that was the spark, the flame that began the Tunisian Revolution. And then that would spark the Egyptian Revolution, which is still let's say, an unfinished revolution. So many of the young people that fomented that revolution are in jail today in Egypt. But it was amazing at the moment, the Arab Spring. And I think that partly inspired the uprising in Wisconsin that we saw in the winter of 2011. It was amazing, 150,000 people marching because Governor Scott Walker, the Republican governor of Wisconsin, who ran for president briefly, and I think part of why he didn't make it was precisely because of what he tried to do, break up the unions, bust public unions. He went after the teachers and the nurses, but told the police and the firefighters, don't worry, I'm not going after you. Governor Walker's problem was that the police and the firefighters are married to the teachers and the nurses. And so everyone rose up. When we got to the Capitol, flew in from New York, Democracy Now! Team, to see what was happening and broadcast that for all of you. I mean, everyone had occupied the Capitol. They were sleeping in it. I mean, I saw some of the biggest guys I had ever seen, the Oshkosh prison guards, and I went over to them and I said, who did you vote for? And they said, Governor Walker, of course. I said, so what are you doing here? Protesting Governor Walker, of course. He didn't tell us he was going to do this. And outside in the freezing cold, I saw among the 150,000 people, older gentlemen, glasses, white hair, marching with a sign that said, IRS auditors against Walker. I said to him, are you a Republican or a Democrat? He said, a Republican. And I said, then what are you doing? He said, I'm sending the governor a message. I said, well, you have a pretty powerful tool if you want to take him down. Anyway, I look out at this vista of protest, and across the way in Madison, across the state capitol, is the State Labor History Museum. I mean, when labor comes together with social and economic justice movements, there's nothing stopping people. And if you think it didn't make a difference that, well, the governor was reelected, there was a recall vote, that failed, and he was reelected, what difference did it all make? It made a tremendous difference, because people feel the power of people coming together. Go back to, well, Wisconsin is interesting. It's the home of the John Birch Society, right? That was co-founded by Fred Koch, the father of Charles and David Koch, the John Birch Society, that racist, segregationist organization that would fight civil rights movement, fight Dr. King, disparage him as much as they could. But it's also the home of AFSCME, 1932, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. So let's go back to 1968, April 4th to be exact, Memphis, Tennessee, when Dr. King died, when Dr. King was murdered in Memphis. What was he there for? He was there to march with sanitation workers who were simply trying to organize a local of AFSCME. Yes, activism makes an enormous difference. A year to the day before he was assassinated, April 4th, 1967, he was speaking at Riverside Church in New York. That's when he gave his speech against the war in Vietnam. Even his closest allies, his inner circle, were telling him, don't do this, Martin. Don't speak against the war in Vietnam. You have the most powerful person on earth, the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, wrapped around your finger. You got him to pass the Voting Rights Act. You got him to pass the Civil Rights Act. This war is not your war. And he said no. He saw it as a seamless web. And when he gave that speech, he said, my country, the country he loved, the United States, is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. He was slammed by the corporate press. Life magazine, I have the issue. Washington Post, Time magazine, they said his speech sounded like a script from Radio Hanoi. They said he had done a disservice to his cause, his country, and his people. And he just doubled down and spoke more often about the war and connecting the violence at home with the violence abroad, and within a year, he would be killed. But then move forward in this year 2011 to the summer. To the summer of 2011, 1,200 people get arrested outside the White House protesting the Keystone XL pipeline, the environmental movement. Bill McKibben gets arrested. Naomi Klein, who wrote This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate and the Shock Doctrine, the rise of disaster capitalism, how important these books are and their activism is. And a few weeks later, what happens in New York, September 17, 2011, Occupy Wall Street. Thousands stream into Zuccotti Park. The corporate media did not cover them at all for the first week. Here the media moguls are driving by in their limousines. The elite media is walking by. This is the media capital of the world. Of course, Democracy Now! Was talking about it before it happened, during. We broadcast from there. But they didn't want to talk about it. And then I remember Erin Burnett, who started her show on CNN right about then. Her first piece on Occupy, I think it was the first day of her broadcast on that show out front, was called Seriously? And that's how the media dealt with it when they did, to mock it. To say, what do these people want? They talk about they're against the death penalty, they're against inequality, they're concerned about climate change, they're against the war. I thought, oh my God, the media is listening, right? But they saw it as their weakness. They can't decide on a single issue. I saw it as their strength. Because like Dr. King, they saw all of these issues as connected. And then they said, where are their leaders? Well, it's not a leaderless movement. It is a leaderful movement. Okay, the police eviscerated the encampments all over the country of Occupy in a coordinated action. But did that wipe out Occupy as everyone would believe? Hardly. Occupy became like the most used new word, and used for this purpose, I think, in that year, according to one of the major dictionaries. You say the word 1% and 99%, absolutely everyone knows what you mean. You change the language, you change the world. A few days later, Well, many of the signs that people held at Occupy, as people streamed in, said, "I am Troy Davis," and "too much doubt." What was this about? How many of you know who Troy Davis was? Troy Davis. Why were they carrying these signs? Interesting that one of the things that the Bernie Sanders delegates got in the Democratic platform this year for the first time was a plank against the death penalty. So, Democracy Now! Went from Occupy in New York City down to Atlanta, Georgia, and drove into Jackson 4 days later, because on September 21st, 2011, Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die. We were reporting live from the grounds outside Georgia's death row in the town of Jackson, awaiting news about whether the U.S. Supreme Court would spare his life. "I am Troy Davis" had become the rallying cry of a growing international movement to stop his execution. The effort had grown, now included not just traditional anti-death penalty activists, but prosecutors, prison wardens, a former U.S. president, and the Pope. This is the story of a struggle against death that refuses to die. Troy grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Savannah. He lived in the same ranch house all his life with his parents, 3 sisters, and brothers. His mother worked at the local hospital. His dad, a carpenter, was a Korean War vet. On the night of August 18, 1989, 18-year-old Troy, who's African-American, went to Charlie Brown's pool hall with a friend. In the parking lot outside, a guy named Sylvester Red Coles, a neighborhood tough, was arguing loudly with a homeless man named Larry Young. Several witnesses testified later. Coles pistol-whipped Young. Pool hall patrons came outside, joined other bystanders to see what was going on. Troy Davis tried to intervene in the fight, but fled when Coles threatened him with a gun. At 1:15 in the morning, Mark McPhail, a white off-duty Savannah police officer who was working as a security guard at a Greyhound bus station next door, came outside to break up the fight. Gunshots pierced the summer night. Moments later, McPhail lay dying with a bullet wound to the head and another to the heart. He never drew his gun. Mark McPhail was a hero cop. He tried to help this homeless man, and he died. The question was, who murdered him? Red Coles raced to the police station, accompanied by a lawyer, and identified Troy Davis as the shooter. But the day after the shooting, Davis was 4 hours away in Atlanta job hunting with his cousin. While he was there, the police launched a high-profile manhunt, splashed Troy's picture across newspapers and TV. His family is panicked. They tried to reach Troy. His sister, Martina Correa, was a remarkable woman. I have interviewed her so many times. Martina was this Persian Gulf Army nurse. She came back, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and then she became this champion for women to get mammograms. Her face adorned every Savannah mammogram van to encourage black women, poor women, to get mammograms. Oh, she was hailed as a leading light with Nancy Pelosi in Washington and others. She's fighting for her own life. She's fighting for women's lives, and now she has to take on the fight for her brother's life. She goes and gets Troy. She says, "You've got to come back." He didn't know what was going on. He comes back and he immediately turns himself into the Chatham County Sheriff's Office. This teenager thought it was a case of mistaken identity. He'd simply clear up the confusion. Instead, Troy was charged with murder. He was held in jail for 2 years before finally being tried. A jury deliberated for 2 hours, returned a guilty verdict. On August 30th, 1991, Troy Anthony Davis, age 20, was sentenced to die. Davis would spend the next 20 years, half of his life, on death row. During that time, 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses recanted or changed their testimony, with a number alleging police intimidation for their original false statements. The one who would not recant was the man who many named as the actual killer, Red Coles. No physical evidence linked Troy Davis to the shooting. So that was the situation. There were 4 death warrants that were signed against Troy. The first 3, they were vacated. This was the 4th. No one knew if he would be executed on that date, September 21st. So we raced down, and let me describe what happened on that day. Davis's lawyers filed a request with the U.S. Supreme Court for a stay of execution. The world watched to see whether Davis's final appeal would be granted. We were the only news outlet broadcasting live continuously from the prison grounds in Jackson, Georgia, for 6 hours that day. We would broadcast, and let me tell you how the media works. We hired a truck, a satellite truck from Atlanta. This is expensive. But we knew if we were going to do this, we had to do it like the big boys do, right? All of the satellite vans were there. But they were off in a corner. The prison had set up a protest pen for only 150 protesters. Human rights leaders were there. Martina, now in a wheelchair, she would die weeks later, was there with the family. If we stayed where the satellite vans were, we'd never be able to interview the people. I wasn't there to speak for 6 hours, but actually neither were these journalists. They were going to maybe report for, 20 seconds, because their media outlets weren't going to do this. How would people find out what was happening? And so our satellite truck came up. The guys who came from Atlanta, we didn't know them, just had hired them. CNN would use them later. Fox had been using them, but for this day we had them. And I was annoyed they were late. Troy was scheduled to die that evening at 7, Jackson, Georgia time. Finally, they came up on the grounds. They said, "Where do you want the truck, man?" And, I saw that the prison guards had forced all the satellite vans in the corner, but, that's not where we wanted to broadcast. I said, "Well, the prison guards say you have to." "No, ma'am. Where do you want the truck?" I was starting to warm up to these guys. I said, "Well, you see the protest pen over there? If we could just," and they barreled this truck over to the protest pen. The guards came running over. They got out these satellite truck camera operators. They were bigger than the Oshkosh prison guards, definitely bigger than these guys. And the prison guards backed off. And then they handed me the microphone. They said, "Where do you want to broadcast?" So I said, "Well, I thought if I go right up against the rope, I can speak to everyone." They said, "Start the show." And they formed a kind of protective semicircle around me with their cameras redefining what it means to shoot. And they said, "Start talking." And so we did. What a day it would turn out to be. Now, the Department of Corrections had given us the press packet. It was very thin, that would talk about what would happen to Troy that day. The press packet first talked about the schedule. They said that Troy would be able to see his family from 9 to 3. Then they would have to clear out because he would have to go through a routine physical. Routine physical? They were going to execute him in a few hours. They cared about his cholesterol count. That astounded people. Then it described what he would be eating. He turned down the special meal, so he would get the standard fare. And the press packet of the Department of Corrections went into detail. They said he would be offered the standard fare, quote, grilled cheeseburgers, oven brown potatoes, baked beans, coleslaw, cookies, and a grape beverage. The next page listed the lethal cocktail that would follow. 4 lines: pentobarbital, pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride, and Ativan, a sedative, in parentheses. The pentobarbital anesthetizes, the pancuronium bromide paralyzes, and the potassium chloride stops the heart. Davis refused the sedative and the Last Supper. By 7 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court was reportedly reviewing Davis's plea for a stay. The case was referred to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who hails from Pinpoint, Georgia, a community founded by freed slaves that's near Savannah, where Troy grew up. The Supreme Court denied the plea. Davis's execution began at 10:53 p.m. A prison spokesperson delivered the news to the reporters outside. Time of death, 11:08 p.m. The eyewitnesses to the execution stepped out. You know how an execution works. The prisoner is rolled out in a gurney, strapped down, hands and feet. They're sticking the injection needle into his arm. And just as they are about to do this, they open the curtains on a window, and the audience is there. It's the family of the murder victim. It is the people the prisoner wants there if the prison approves, and it's the reporters. So, according to an Associated Press reporter who was there, these were Troy Davis's final words. He said, "I'd like to address the McPhail family. Let you know I'm not the one who killed your son, your father, your brother. I am innocent. The incident that happened that night was not my fault. I did not have a gun. All I can ask is that you look deeper into this case so that you can really finally see the truth. I asked my family and friends to continue to fight this fight." And then he turned to his executioners and he said, "For those about to take my life, God have mercy on your souls, and may God bless your souls." The state of Georgia took Davis's body to Atlanta for an autopsy, charging his family for the transportation. On Troy Davis's death certificate, the cause of death is listed simply as homicide. As we stood in the grounds of the prison just after Troy Davis was executed, the Georgia Department of Corrections threatened to pull the plug on our broadcast. The show was over. I was reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi reportedly answered when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He said, "I think it would be a good idea." And then I want to end with December of 2011, the power of movements. That was the December of the UN Climate Summit in Durban, South Africa. If you are a regular viewer or listener or reader of Democracy Now! On Provincetown Community Television or on Outermost Radio, WOMR, you know we go to every UN Climate Summit. The first in Copenhagen, we started in 2009, then we went to Durban and Doha, we went to Cancun, to Poland, to Peru, and to Paris this past year. And you might say, given what happens inside, why waste the fuel? Because of what happens outside, the thousands of people who come from all over the planet, from the most threatened regions of the globe, the 15-year-old boy who came from the Maldives to say, "You are drowning my country." The people of sub-Saharan Africa who say, "You are cooking our continent." We too suffer from severe climate change. If only the meteorologists on television would connect these disparate conditions. You can have the 1,000-year flood in Colorado. You can have Queen Irene taking down Vermont. You can have the Dust Bowl conditions of the Midwest and the fires of California and the Northwest. You can have the freezing conditions of the winter in the Northeast. How do you connect the heat and the cold? By the people on television who tell you the weather, but they don't. They flash the words severe weather or extreme weather constantly. But what about another two words, global warming or climate change? We tune into the weather. People tune in more for the weather than anything else. It shouldn't just be to find out what to wear, but what we can do about it. People are so much more sophisticated around the world. They're having debates around what to do about climate change. Here in this country, the debate is whether or not humans have anything to do with it. Now, it's as if every time we talked about planet Earth, we had on someone from the Flat Earth Society for balance. Something unusual happened that year, at the end of 2011, in Durban, South Africa. Of the thousands of people who crowd to these places, often don't get into the inner sanctum where the UN global body is meeting. Some people were invited in, the youth. And I wanted to end with the words of a young woman who at the time was a student at College of the Atlantic in Maine, in Bar Harbor. I was a visiting student there. I know this place well, where you get a degree in human ecology, seeing the connectedness of all things. And Anjali was chosen by all her youth colleagues to come in and speak for the young people. Hundreds came in and they surrounded this UN body. And she came up on the stage And she looked out on the audience representing the diplomats and the bureaucrats, the scientists from all over the world, and said, I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all of my life. You've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, you've broken promises, but you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. The science tells us we have 5 years max. You're saying, give us 10. The starkest betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition. Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion, she said. She then said, there is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, and to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality. And then she quoted Nelson Mandela, who said, it always seems impossible until it's done. And so she looked out on the world body and said, so distinguished delegates in governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now, get it done. And so the young people instructed their elders. The next year we saw Anjali in Doha, in Qatar, attending the UN Climate Summit there. We were covering it, and I saw her outside on the street, and I said, I'd like you to come in so we can talk to you. And she said, I can't. I've been banned for my comments last year. So I want to go back to World War II with this brief story, where we will end. A brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl, who together with their professor and other workers thought, what could they do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians. And they decided that at least they would get information out so the Germans would never be able to deny what had taken place. So they put out a series of pamphlets, 6 in all. And on one of them, it said, we will not be silent. These pamphlets they had distributed everywhere. Under cover of darkness, they would be distributed in alleyways and marketplaces, in schoolyards. But soon, they were captured by the Nazis. Hans and Sophie, the brother and sister, their professor, members of this group they had formed called the White Rose Collective. Hans and Sophie were tried. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of journalists today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy now.